Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. And wow, some new faces as well. Hooray. Um, oh, it's a great pleasure now to have two speakers that are absolutely fundamental for this project. One is Anne, the other one is Elliott. And I just quickly read out their, like a brief bio for both of them to just show, like the breadth and scope of their work. So Anne, obviously the director of the project that led to the inventory that is the focus of this workshop, is a research professor and distinguished professor emerita of religious studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and has long-standing interests in theory and method as they relate to the historical, comparative, and scientific study of non-ordinary experiences. She's the author of numerous articles and books, including Fits, Trances, and Visions from Princeton, 1999, Religious Experience, Reconsidered, Princeton, 2009, and Revelatory Events, Princeton, 2016. I already mentioned she was the mastermind behind developing the inventory, and she is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the past president of the American Academy of Religion. And Elliott is a cognitive scientist studying religious, spiritual, and other non-ordinary experiences as a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His research explores interactions between perception, cognition, and cultural practices in the causation and interpretation of such experiences. And as part of this, Elliott co-developed a survey validation method called Response Process Evaluation, RPE, which you will hear a lot about still today and tomorrow in particular. There will be one section of the workshop specifically on that process. And this method allows researchers to efficiently identify misunderstandings, revise items, and collect evidence that items are understood as intended by the target population. He also runs the YouTube channel Ihm, Curious, which explores recent developments in neuroscience, neurotechnology, and consciousness science. So without further ado, welcome both of you to the stage, and I'm looking forward to this, I'm sure, very stimulating presentation. Please.
Okay. Well, thank you for the introduction, and it's really nice to see you all here. It's kind of amazing to have our inventory make it all the way to Brazil, and not only that, but to show up in a conference where it's actually important. So what we're going to talk about today, the talk has three parts. I'm going to do the first part. Elliott's going to do the second part about the response process evaluation method, and then I'm going to do the third part on some results that we've gotten. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about how the inventory came to be. And the story actually goes way back to the 1980s. I was trained in graduate school in the history of Christianity and then hired in the early 1980s to teach in a Methodist theological school where I was expected to teach a course on Methodist history. And that was really my, just a minute here. Okay. That was my first exposure in a deep way to some of the phenomena associated with early Methodism. And this is a picture of some people falling under the weight, collapsing under the weight of the Holy Spirit, and then rising up after sometimes having out-of-body experiences and things like that to shout with joy because they're saved. But when I first discovered these experiences, kind of in the way that Alexander talked about this morning, I was totally at a loss to understand them. I had no framework for thinking about these things. But at about that same time, at what was, in the US anyway, the height of what some have called the multiple personality epidemic, I had a friend who was diagnosed with MPD and who talked to me about her experiences of her altered personalities and losing time. This kind of blew me out of the water. I never thought that the mind could do things like that. And so that led me to a book that came out in, I think, 1989. It was one of the early introductions by a psychiatrist to multiple personality disorder. First introductory chapter compared multiple personality to shamanistic experiences. And that is what then produced a kind of aha experience for me, where all of a sudden I realized that there was some phenomenological overlap between what psychiatrists were studying in terms of dissociative disorders, and I'm adding some other things to that now, and what anthropologists were studying in terms of shamanism and spirit possession, and what I was studying in religious studies in terms of religious experience, spiritual or mystical experience. So it was that connection across disciplines that kind of pulled my research out of religious studies and into a kind of interdisciplinary space between disciplines that really doesn't exactly have a name. And it's that aha experience that suggested the possibility, as I would put it today, that both researchers and subjects, or people studied, were appraising experiences with similar phenomenological features in different ways. And, sorry, it's hard to read my notes on here. The recognition of those similarities precipitated a shift in my research focus, which since that time has been centered here. And although I initially approached it as a historian, and the first big book that came out of this was historical, I began to think about how to study them scientifically in the early 80s. It wasn't until I moved to the University of California at Santa Barbara, which is a big research university, out of a Christian theological seminary, that I had colleagues who were studying all different religions. And so it was in the context of a religious studies department at Santa Barbara that I started thinking in explicitly comparative direction, not just between religious experiences and psychiatric experiences, say, in one context. In other words, instead of just thinking about the US or you all just thinking about Brazil, I started thinking about how do we compare the US and Brazil. But we didn't actually pick Brazil for comparative purposes. Nobody in my department was an expert on Brazil, but we did have experts on South Asian religions. So that's why, in the end, you're going to see some stuff about comparing India and the US. But that was actually a kind of radical move to make, at least within religious studies, because comparison within religious studies, in the humanities, people tend to be very place and culture specific. They get very worried about comparisons that are all in the minds of the researcher that are set up in the minds of the researcher. So one of the big motivations for forming our religion, experience, and mind lab group was to see if we could bring together graduate students who were studying various religious traditions and some folks from psychology, Elliott being one of them, and work together to see if we could find ways to bridge. And the first task that we took up was looking to see if there were any existing surveys that would help us to do this. After trying and failing to revise some of the existing surveys, we finally discovered one survey and one interview that I'll come back to later, but one was a survey of paranormal experiences that separated the experience from how they were appraised. This is a scale that Irwin developed. I'll give you a reference later. And the other was an interview protocol that was developed by psychosis researchers where they refined all their items for their interview with focus groups that had people from the general population and people who had been diagnosed with a psychotic disorder. So both of them wound up describing experiences in neutral phenomenological language and then followed up with questions. And those two surveys were really the inspiration for the Inventory of Nonordinary Experiences. So the initial questions that we designed the inventory to explore is, first of all, whether our classifications as researchers, whether our classifications of experience, for example, as religious, paranormal, anomalous, or pathological, are stable across cultures. I've been suspicious for a while that the distinction between religious experiences and paranormal experiences may not be particularly stable, and other cultures may not have those categories and want to distinguish between those types of things. The second is, how does the way that either researchers or the people that we're studying, how do the classification schemes that we have available to us affect how frequently people have or report these experiences? And the third, the bottom line question for the inventory, how can we compare experiences across cultures given these different disciplinary and cultural classifications? So to refine these initial research questions, I want to talk about two things. What do we mean by experience, and what do we mean by comparison? So, starting with experience. If you think about the word experience, I hope this translates into Portuguese. But anyway, in English, we have an abstract, general sense of the term experience, which we can define as the flow of information that we're aware of, okay? But we can also refer to experiences in the plural, or an experience. And when we talk about an experience, we're talking about a self-reported event. And it's often subjective, but it has a beginning and the end. And how people narrate it to us basically gives us the cues to when they consider it as starting and stopping. In what I'm going to talk about, I'm also going to use the word lived experience. There isn't a big difference between experience in a way and lived experience, but when I refer to lived experience, what I'm trying to do is to emphasize the complexity of first-person accounts of their experience. And so first-person accounts are laden with claims about the experience. Claims aren't just made after the fact. Their appraisals can be embedded in the experience as it emerges in real time, and much cultural information can also be embedded in the experience as it occurs in real time. And of course, accounts of experiences can always be reconstructed and reinterpreted after the fact. But so lived experience just is intended to remind you of how complex an account of an experience is. Okay, then experience items, that's the term that we use for the experience questions in the Inventory of Nonordinary Experiences. And finally, given this morning's talk, oops, what did I do? Oh, there. Non-ordinary experiences. Here's how we're defining it. And stands out are the key words in this. So we're using non-ordinary to refer to experiences that stand out for people relative to what they consider ordinary or everyday. And a big issue here is that we don't know how cross-culturally stable ordinary is. We don't know how much what counts as everyday experience differs between cultural contexts. So as you'll see with our items, we're introducing some items that people have said, well, those are pretty ordinary. And that's particularly the experience items. And so for most of them, they come with an ending that says X experience that stands out from other similar such experiences. Okay, so that's trying to capture the standing out quality. Okay, so what is a comparison? Here's a non-controversial definition of a comparison. It allows us to investigate similarities and differences between two things or sets of things based on a perceived common feature. So if we think about this visually, we can think about set 1 and set 2. And both sets have a bunch of features in them. Each of those little colored circles are supposed to represent features. And the common feature becomes the two features that they share in common. But notice that the other features could be similar to each other or could be different. And so that's capturing how the phenomenology can differ, but also how the set and setting, all that kind of stuff can differ as well. Okay, and notice, I was using the difference in color of the background circles to indicate that the contexts of the experience are different as well. So if we now make set 1 and set 2 lived experiences, and our experience items are trying to assess a common feature, we can then add some specifics. Say, the first lived experience could be one that the subject considers spirit possession, and the second could be one that a psychiatrist has diagnosed as dissociative identity disorder. And then the point of comparison would be the subjective sense that there's another entity in the body. And because we don't just want to know about the similarities in a comparison, because we want to know about the differences as well, what the inventory does is it follows, if a person says yes to one of our experience items, we then give them follow-up questions. And the follow-up questions help us to understand the lived experience in which the feature is embedded. So here's the three key aspects or characteristics of the inventory. First, it separates generic features from claims-laden lived experiences. It queries both the features and the appraisals in the experience items and the follow-ups. And it queries a wide range of experiences that might stand out for people. So I'll come back to each of these points. But here's a schematic diagram then of the theoretical framework. So the experience items, they're in the central circle at the top. People give a yes/no response. If they say yes, then they get a variety of follow-ups, some of which ask about the context of their experience, and others that ask particularly appraisal questions in the sense of how that they interpreted it. And then we also, ask individual difference questions that are there under background and belief and practice. And so here I've actually given you the citations for the two earlier one's an inventory and the other, or scale, and one's a interview. So Irwin and Brett are the two that gave us the inspiration for this design. But neither Irwin's scale, which was called the Survey of Anomalous Experiences, or the annex, which was called, do I have it here? Let's see, sorry. Okay, sorry, I can't pull up the title, but their annex is in another abbreviation that uses, and I think it uses anomalous experience as well. So one's designed for paranormal experiences and one's designed for, to differentiate psychotic from non-psychotic unusual experiences. And they're both using, I think, anomalous or some other term, but this goes back to what Alexander was saying about the incredible confusion of terminology. Okay, so the problem here that I was trying to get at is both Irwin and Brett designed their instruments for specific purposes. So Irwin had all experiences on there. Oh, all right, so this is terrible on timing. Irwin had all experiences on there that had to do with what people think of as paranormal experiences in cultures that use that term. And Brett had ones that are useful for distinguishing psychotic experiences. Neither of those covered the range of experiences that we wanted to get at. So we looked at all these scales. That's the first thing we did. We looked at religious scales and anomalous scales intended to measure paranormal, anomalous type experiences. This tells you the actual terms of the construct they claim to measure, and I categorize them based on the kinds of questions they were asking. We also looked at psychological scales, and we looked at psychiatric scales. There's the annex, the appraisals of anomalous experience interview probes. Okay. So if you go through these scales, you find out that there's items on these scales that are ostensibly measuring different constructs that have very similar items. So, for example, non-ordinary presences appear on religious, paranormal, and psychiatric scales. So here's how we revised to create our presence item. This shows you the kind of presence that was queried in those 5 different scales. Here's our presence item at the bottom. And so in creating this, we eliminated the named presences, God, ghosts, elves, and extraterrestrials, as well as adjectives modifying the presences like mystical or evil. And we decided on generic terms for the presences, drawing from the page R there at the bottom, that German-based inventory. And in contrast to all 5 items, we added what seemed to be. And this is kind of like the discussion of alleged in the conversation before. Because when people have these experiences, we wanted them to focus on the phenomenology, whether it seemed like there was a presence there, whether or not they really believed there was, okay? So we think that as seemed as is really important. But in addition to deriving experiences from existing scales, we also added experiences that we thought might stand out for people as non-ordinary and items that we knew some cultures or religious traditions viewed as religious or spiritual. So on this is just a sampling of items. You're not going to be able to read this real quickly, but what you see on the left in bold are our nicknames for the items, and we're going to be using nicknames in our discussion of those, but this is what an actual item looks like. The ones I put in red are examples of ones that we added because we knew that those kinds of experiences were valorized or cultivated by some religious traditions. So here's a sample of using a paper and pencil format, which usually we do it online, but this is more helpful for a projection. So here's the presence is dead question, then is the answer options are yes or no. If they answer yes, they get 7 follow-up questions. I tend to block them with these first 3 here on mental state, impact, and life effect, because these are very general questions that are the sort that I think anybody would want to follow up with. But these next 4 are ones that I would stress that we wanted to have in the inventory because I was coming out of religious studies and these reflected research questions that I had on my mind. So first one, do you consider this experience religious or spiritual? You know, somebody doing political science research might have a totally different kind of follow-up question on how people categorize an experience. So that's really a category question. And the ones that come after that are all related to people's appraisal of the experience, again, from a more religious studies kind of research question. Framework. Okay. So 2 big issues that I want to leave you with before I turn it over to Elliott is, first of all, we had to wrestle with, obviously, what experiences we were going to include on the inventory. The thing that I really want to stress in relation to that is that the inventory is not intended to measure a construct. This, in that way, it differs from most psychological scales or instruments. So each item stands on its own and it has to be validated on its own. The whole instrument or the whole inventory is not validated as a whole measuring a construct. And that means that the fact that we couldn't validate all the items that we originally came up with is fine. It also means that if you use it, you can use some items and not others. It also means that if you want to add items, which I gather the Brazilian team is doing right and left, you can do that too, okay? And then the second thing is, and this is the turnover question, will people recognize generically worded experiences in their own lived experience. This is a critical question if you look at the discussions of comparative research in terms of methodology and in terms of survey validation. And so we developed a survey based on the premise that people could do this. And our whole validation process is designed to test whether they really could. And so that means that we have really two sets of research questions. The first are the research questions that went into the validation process, and the second is the research questions that go into analysis of data that we collect with the inventory. So Elliott's going to talk about that first set of questions, and I'll return to give you some insight into the second. And with that, you're on.
All right, thank you, Anne, and it's great to be here. I just had my first glass of Guaraná, and you guys drink coffee very efficiently here, which I appreciate. So I'm here to talk about the validation process, how we applied it to the inventory, and well, I'll start with these slides. So we developed this method. The validation method had been kind of floating around in the heads of some people at UC Santa Barbara in the education department who are kind of radical measurement people. And the inventory turned out to be a really great context for developing that method. So most of the time when you look at a scale, you see, oh, it's validated, and they cite some validation study. But almost none of these validation studies actually ask participants what they think an item means. This is rarely ever considered. Usually researchers focus exclusively on quantitative validity evidence. They might add a few riffs on theory here and there. Rarely is it systematically tied to this quantitative evidence. Factor analysis is very common. One factor, multiple factors, Cronbach's alpha for reliability, and importantly, convergent discriminant validity. Does this measure correlate with another measure that was also validated only quantitatively and not by asking anyone what they think the questions mean? So it gets rather circular. And nothing wrong with these quantitative methods. They show numerical patterns, and you do a confirmatory factor analysis to make sure items are covariating in the same way across multiple studies. But they don't tell you what these patterns represent. That's up to the researcher to kind of read the tea leaves and figure out, okay, what does this factor represent? And that's where a lot of hand-waving happens and bullshitting a lot of the time. So what do items mean to participants? Well, we don't really have to ask if we have a factor analysis. So let's look at some very valid survey items here, as demonstrated with factor analysis. So here's a question. Let's look at question 1. You have a certain amount of gavagai, and you can't really do much to change it. How many people agree with this statement? And how many disagree? All right, not very many, because gavagai doesn't mean anything. Unfortunately, you can get a perfectly good-looking factor analysis even if you aren't measuring a real construct. So here we've got 2 factors came out, and it happens to be because some of them are worded positively or negatively. Another piece of advice that's given to survey developers without always having a lot of thought, oh, have some reverse-coded items. Well, then you get 2 factors. And so maybe you could get carried away and say, oh, we've got 2 subscales. We've got one for gavagai stability and one for gavagai malleability. And so you can see how you can end up talking a lot about nothing if you just rely on these quantitative methods. So you can even get one factor with very high factor loadings from completely blank survey items or total gibberish. So even if you are starting to believe in gavagai, a blank survey item will do the same. So if meaningless items can pass these quantitative tests, clearly we need a higher standard for survey validation. So traditional quantitative evidence of validity can be misleading. The quantitative structure is great. It's really helpful. It's important to include, but it doesn't tell you what you're measuring. And validation research rarely includes evidence based on what's called the response process. And this is defined as the cognitive processes participants use when they're responding to a survey item. So how people interpret the item, whether they misinterpret it, maybe there's patterns, maybe a certain reliable proportion of participants are misinterpreting some things in a certain way. When someone chooses one response option, why did they pick that option? Why did they choose this one over a different one? Do the people who choose the same option, are they doing it for the same reasons? Within a population of interest, maybe people answer questions in a certain way, but then in another subgroup, they'll have different reasons for answering in a certain way. These are all in the domain of response process evidence, one of the validity evidence categories in the standards of educational and psychological testing that's rarely reported on. So when it is reported on, it's not like it never happens. You can run focus groups or do cognitive interviews, and this is various ways of getting people to reflect and tell you about their response process. One common method is the think aloud protocol, where people just tell you what's going through their head while they respond to a survey item. A cognitive interview could ask them additional questions, why did you pick that? What does this key word in the item mean to you? And then you can have a lot of back and forth discussion on the basis of that, and that tells you a lot about how participants are interpreting your items. But this isn't done very often because they take a lot of time. Few researchers are trained to use them. Now, not that many researchers are trained on factor analysis either, but you've got a menu in SPSS, you can run a factor analysis, you get 2 factors, and that'll get you published. So a more efficient way to collect this response process data, it's called web probing, and this uses open-ended questions you give in an online survey, and they're similar questions to cognitive interviews. But it's sort of a one-way thing. You ask a question, you get a response, and you can't ask a follow-up question. And often it's a one-stage thing to sort of see how people are interpreting your items. And so our approach, response process evaluation, is an iterative kind of version of web probing so iterative meaning we do it a few times with an item, and we try to refine the item in response to what participants are saying. Do people understand it as intended? Are there common interpretations we want to rule out? We'll revise the item, launch some more. So first, participants, we show them our items, and then we give them what are called probes, which are just questions. We used to call them meta-questions, questions about the questions, until we realized this probing literature exists. So now we call them probes. And so these are really similar to the questions you'd ask in cognitive interviewing. How would you respond to this item? Why would you respond that way? Tell us in your own words, what do you think this item means? And give us an example. Or if you say, no, I haven't had this experience, well, can you give an example of what it would look like? Because you want to make sure the people who are saying no know what they're saying no to. And let us know if anything is confusing about the item. And one of our early use cases of this came from a meaninglessness item, which initially we had worded, I've had an experience of meaninglessness that stood out from all other such experiences. And one response we got, someone says, hey, this question is too ambiguous. Is it asking about feeling meaningless as a person or an event or thing that felt meaningless, like sitting through a long graduation ceremony you don't know anybody who's involved in, you just have to play the same note over and over on the trumpet for 3 hours. That would feel pretty meaningless, but that's not what we're looking for. We want this first thing. We want to, do you feel meaningless as a person? Type of thing people report in depression, for example. So we updated the item on the basis of this feedback to be more clear. I've had an experience in which it felt as if my life had no meaning or purpose. Probably a couple other revisions in the meantime, but that ended up being understood much more uniformly. We didn't have people think, well, if I watched a really boring movie, should I say yes to this? That misinterpretation disappeared. So you can't always rely on your participants to ask such a direct, good question and clarify your construct of interest for you. It's really important to be clear and explicit about what you want to measure starting as early as you can. And having a clear definition is the best way to make sure you are consistently applying a single definition, because it's really easy to slip out and want to include a lot of other things and not be consistent about it. So the intended interpretation is what we call the explicit definition of each item. And we use this to determine if participants understand the item as intended. So when we're reviewing their responses, we have the intended interpretation in mind. And also, really importantly, is once we finalize the items, we want to make sure this intended interpretation is available for researchers so they know what the items are measuring and they can decide, hey, do I want to use this item? Well, what is it exactly measuring? And so it's useful for us in validating the item, but it's also really important validation evidence to present alongside the items. When we started validating the inventory, we did not have a consistent definition, but for this item that I'll talk about for a few examples, love and compassion, but I'll show you how we should have started and what we ended up doing as we realized how important this kind of thing was. So we have an item that's looking for an experience of love or compassion, and our intended interpretation is 3 parts. An experience of either A, love, deep feeling of affection and attachment, blah, 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 or compassion, sympathetic pity and concern for the sufferings and misfortune of others, that stands out, which we define as being markedly different from all their other experiences of compassion, or markedly different from what they consider ordinary or everyday experiences of that sort. So you might have some compassion every day. A kid is doing stuff, they stub their toe, maybe that happens 3 times a day. It becomes pretty everyday. But then you see some horrible atrocity, you're inspired to take action. That's an example that stands out compared to the rest. So having a starting point like this will make it a lot easier to tell if people understand your item or not. So here's an example of, what the survey would look like. So we kind of get participants in on the research process. We don't just ask them questions. We let them know, hey, we're trying to see how well these items work. Just read the item, let us know what you think, try to answer it, we'll ask you a bunch of questions. So we say, okay, when we show this to our future participants, current participants, we're going to start by giving them these instructions. And these instructions we gave to all the items, and we even put on the top of every page of the survey, because one thing we've learned is people forget instructions very fast. So for all the items, we want to make sure they indicate whether or not they've had the experience by selecting yes or no, and they should only select yes if they can remember at least one specific experience that stands out. And then they need to have a specific experience in mind so we can ask them questions about it too. So the item, the first iteration or version of the item, have had an experience of love or compassion that stood out from all other such experiences. And our first probe, our response probe, we just asked them, well, if these are the response options, what would you select, yes or no? And if they say yes or no, we will ask them a bunch more follow-up questions. Here's some of the probes. The probes vary from item to item. Some of them are sort of cookie cutter. Some of them we tweak a little to ask about specific items. And sometimes we'll make up a probe just for one item, a unique probe, because there's some specific confusion we want to clear up. So the response probe, what would you pick? The comprehension probe, we might ask them to explain in their own words some specific key phrase. We might ask them to paraphrase the whole item. And one of the really important ones, category selection. We ask why they picked this category. Our categories in this case are just yes and no. So if they say yes, we want to know if they've chosen this response for the right reason. So we ask them, hey, tell us the experience you have in mind. We see if it matches our interpretation. Or if they said no, we want them to give us an example, as I said earlier, to make sure they're saying no to the thing we have in mind. And then we might ask a catch-all question in case they have other issues with the item. So once we get responses to these probes, we evaluate. This was our first pass at a rating scale. We still use it, but I just say that because there's nothing set in stone about these categories. We've found them to work pretty well for overall coding and also for prompting discussion about the item. So we rate them on a scale from understood. 1 is like, yeah, they understand pretty much beyond a reasonable doubt, or not understood. A 5, they really don't seem to understand. 2 and 4, the likely understood or likely not understood, we're still pretty confident they understand it or not, but it would be great if we could have asked them one additional question about it. We're not positive, but we're definitely leaning strongly in one way or the other. And then if we can't tell, we give them a 3 for not enough information. Means we just, based on their response, maybe it was a really short response or they said confusing, ambiguous things, we don't know how to code it. So we try to assign a code like that to everything, and here's some example responses. Someone who said yes to the response probe, and we asked about love and compassion, intense feelings of affection or sympathy, sounds great. The paraphrase, asking if I've ever experienced love or compassion, well, it's a little, we're not asking if they've ever experienced, we were asking about a specific standout experience, but when they give us their example, they say, after my dog died, I felt compassion for animals and started eating meat 1 to 2 times a month only. So this clearly was a standout experience. We can use context clues. We know someone's dog dying, having this big of an effect on them, seems to fit our idea of what stands out. And if you want a pedantic explanation of how we assess that, you can check out our paper, not this one cited here, but the inventory paper in +1. So we gave this an understood code. They seem to have a really powerful experience of compassion they could talk about. Another response, someone else said yes. They define love and compassion, but their example, the category selection probe, they said, I have intense feelings of love all the time for my children, for my husband. Also, I'm a compassionate person, which is not an example of a specific experience. So we said no, and we will get a little more into that example in a second, but this is a common misunderstanding. Instead of a specific experience, this is part of the reason we bold the instructions about a specific experience. This is not a specific experience. So we'll get into the implications of that in a second. But we rate them. We have multiple raters. It's important to establish, these are subjective ratings, so in order to make them more objective, we use these quantitative methods to establish that at least our raters are reliable with each other. And early on, especially early on in the coding process, and then for as long as you want, the raters will, after they code, the responses will meet and discuss anything where they disagree. Also, might try to clarify things that are confusing about the coding scheme. So there could be some revisions to the coding guide early on. It's important to meet until people are reliably on the same page about how to code the items. And then if you want to keep meeting and maybe establish a total consensus for everything, you can do that too. But once people are reliable, that's good enough for government work. So then once we have coded things, we agree on the codes, we revise the items if there's common misunderstandings, and then we retest them. And if we're getting a lot of experiences that are hard to code, or if there's a certain aspect of the experience people aren't telling us about, we might revise the probes also. We might add a new probe, because the most important thing in this process is to make sure we're getting enough information to evaluate the item with confidence. And then if we try, we revise the probes a lot, we revise the items, and we just can't figure out how to fix these misinterpretations, we will get rid of that item and maybe try again later. So here's just a quick walkthrough of some stuff we did for the love and compassion item. So first of all, one thing that happened really early on is some people really zeroed in on the love experience, whether it was familial or friendly or romantic love. Others really focused on compassion. They didn't mention love. They just talked about, seeing a homeless person on the street and feeling really bad for them. So we had a bifurcation, 2 totally different sets of responses. So we just split it into 2 items to make sure we were measuring something more specific. And our compassion item, I'll talk a little more about. I've had an experience of compassion that stood out from all other such experiences. Wow, we've solved this problem. Good to go, right? Well, not exactly. So for the compassion item, sorry, the formatting's a little wonky here, but there were some participants that talked about other people having compassion for them. So we lost our house to foreclosure, couldn't find a place to rent because of our credit, and somebody took compassion on us and rented our house, which is a great experience, very happy it happened to them, but it's not what we are looking for. We want to make sure they felt the emotion of compassion. And so we clarified it to say, I felt compassion for the suffering of others. Also, we had more people who weren't giving us a specific example. There's been many moments in my life that the people around me have given me such feelings. Okay, again, happy for you, but not what we asked. I feel compassion for others every time something tragic happens. Well, you sound like a wonderful person, but again, that's not what we're asking for. So people seem to interpret the item as asking kind of about a trait or about, well, generally, am I the type of person who would feel compassion? Yeah, probably, but not thinking of a specific example. Also, this is a trait that people want to be compassionate. So there's also this social desirability bias towards saying yes when they think of it that way. So we really wanted to emphasize, I can recall a specific experience in which I felt compassion for the suffering of others, human or non-human. We had to clarify some point down the road. That stood out from all other such experiences underlined. And that worked very well. So to recap the big picture process, we start with developing the item and the probe. We come up with an intended interpretation. We use that to write probes that are going to elicit the information we need. Then we administer these meta surveys, these surveys about our survey items. We get responses, we code it, and then we may revise it or we may keep collecting. We will keep collecting data, keep revising until we get an item that we think is the best we can do, and we see how many people understand it. The threshold of how many people have to understand it is also something very much not set in stone. So 80% is something you can use. We may discuss more of that later in this conference. And if fewer people than whatever threshold you think is good enough understand the item, you get rid of it. But if enough people understand it, you write up a report. In the publication, you include the intended interpretation, what it's used for, who you validated it with, how many people understood it, and what ways people misunderstood the item, so that people can be aware of that when they go to use it in their own research. So for the inventory, we used an 85% threshold. Understood or likely understood, we sort of grouped together as understood enough. For our experience items, we had at least 20 people respond to the final version of the item, and if we didn't, when we calculated the proportion understood, we didn't include the not enough information responses in that, but we did if that is a reason to be skeptical. So if you had 20 people understand it as intended, 10 people you didn't have enough information to code, that's kind of a red flag. So we also reported validation scores that included the 3 codes, just for full transparency. We ended up with 38 experience items, 7 follow-up items in the published version. So these items weren't totally understood by everybody, but we were able, in at least the first few iterations, to eliminate a lot of common misunderstandings right off the bat. So even if you can't get a perfect result from this, just doing a little bit of this can be super helpful for eliminating the most egregious misinterpretations. But in the future, we would recommend using a bigger sample and hopefully being able to compute a confidence interval on that proportion understood that falls entirely above some threshold, 80 or 85%. Might be a good starting point. Now, we can probably skip, I'll say a little about, so sometimes very few people will say yes to an item. And so if you have 20 people responding to an item, only 2 said yes, and maybe one of those people misunderstood it. Well, it looks like 95% of people understood the item, even though only 1 out of 2 people who said yes understood the item. So we think it's important to compute the proportion understood for each response option separately. So we call this PPU, positive, for just yes-no items. It's really simple. We have a positive proportion understood and NPU, negative proportion understood, for people who said no, what proportion understood it. And this, if you're familiar with epidemiology, it's like positive and negative predictive value, analogous to that, although for technical reasons called it something else. So these values can be red flags, and so you want to make sure all this information is available for people who are potentially using your items. All right, so there's an example of that we don't really have time to go into, so I'll just, why not? It's quick. We have this item, automaticity, looking for body performing actions outside of our control. And you can see the people who said yes to this item in the US all understood it, but in India only 71%, 5 out of the 7 people, which again, bigger sample size would be great, but we worked with what we had here. And so if only 71% of people who said yes are understanding it. We want to document what the misunderstandings are. So here in India especially, some people are including sleep paralysis when they say yes, which you can see why they might say yes to it, but it's not the body performing actions outside of their control. It's the opposite of that. So we don't want to toss this item completely, but we do document those types of misinterpretations. And then we end up with, here's our truncated validation table from that, just looking at the experience items. We got the proportion understood, how many threes, positive, negative, all kinds of stuff, US and India. So you can see the +1 paper for that. We got rid of some items. I'll talk more about mysticism on day 3, but we took an experience from the Ralph Hood's mysticism scale, an experience in which all things seem to be unified into a single whole. Well, that's obviously about mystical experience, right? But someone talked about a meaningful coincidence. They accept a job offer and meet their significant other. Boom, that points towards mystical experience, if you had that experience. Or in movies where everything wraps up nicely at the end. Unity applies, but it's not exactly the mystical unity that the scale attempts to measure. So we were not able to rehabilitate that item, and many others. So we have some more appraisal items. The key thing for what Anne will talk about next is for some of these, we asked if they considered it religious or spiritual, or as rough equivalents in India, dharmic or adhyatmic. And instead of having a specific predefined definition, intended interpretation, we need to make sure they understand. We were more focused on whether they would apply that label or not, so we got a bunch of information about what they meant by that label, which is also reported here in the paper. So when Anne talks about did they consider it religious or spiritual, we didn't have a strict definition. There we're more focused on the label. We want to ask what counts as religious or spiritual for them. So response process evaluation can be used to revise and validate items, eliminate common misunderstandings early on, and then eventually quantify how many people understand it and document that evidence for your fellow researchers. And with the response process evaluation, we were able to get validity evidence relevant to the questions that Anne brought up. Will people understand the generic features as we intend and recognize them in their lived experiences? Will they understand our appraisal items as we intend? And so, because of that work, we can now measure experiences and appraisals independently of each other, so we can investigate what counts as religious or spiritual or dharmic, adhyatmic across the US and India. Thank you. I will hand it over to Anne.
Okay, on to part 3 as rapidly as we can. Right, I'm a different height here. So as we turn to this question about what counts as religious or spiritual in these two contexts, I want to start out by stressing that scholars do recognize that religious and spiritual experiences vary across traditions and cultures. So scholars of religion have vigorously critiqued an essentialized concept of religious experience and generally recognize that traditions cultivate a wide range of experiences that are aimed at disparate religious goals. And if you look at the psychology of literature, or of religion literature, Ralph Hood, who's generally recognized as the foremost expert on religious experience in psychology of religion, he acknowledges that almost any human experience can be interpreted as religious or spiritual, and that religious traditions typically define what is distinctively religious for their faithful. And then we have the American Psychiatric Association that responded to cultural psychiatrists and medical anthropologists by acknowledging that hallucinations and dissociations may be a normal part of religious experience in some cultural contexts. So we have all these acknowledgments, but most researchers in psychology, psychiatry, and religious studies still avoid dealing with this overlap and between types of experience and the variability within these conceptions by offering stipulated definitions of religion or psychosis or whatever they're trying to measure up front. This means that we have very little empirical data on how experiences are interpreted across traditions and cultures. So, in investigating this, we decided to draw on 3 classical definitions of religion that psychologists and cognitive scientists of religion have been relying on and adapting for years when formulating their own definitions of what they're going to study. And if I didn't make this clear, one of the issues, what we're talking about here is when a researcher stipulates a definition of, in this case, what they mean by religion for religious experience, what on-the-ground experiences, to what extent is that congruent with what people on the ground would consider religious experiences? Okay, so we're trying to look at that gap. Okay, so the first definition that we drew on was Edward Tyler's definition of religion having to do, being minimally defined as general belief in spiritual beings. This definition was taken up by Melford Spiro in a 1966 definition, where he referred to culturally patterned interaction with culturally postulated superhuman beings. If you're familiar with the cognitive science of religion researchers, they've adapted that sort of definition and now refer to spiritual beings as minimally counterintuitive agents. But they're explicitly building on Tyler. In the psychology of religion, and this is the kind of definition that Alexander was referring to in the morning, numerous researchers, including Ken Pargman, Peter Hill, and Ralph Hood, have defined religion and spirituality in terms of a sense of the sacred. But in doing so, they explicitly refer in their 2001 article to Emil Durkheim, an early sociologist who defines religions as beliefs and practices related to sacred things, but sacred things are things that are set apart based on collective, i.e. social agreements. This means, as Hill et al. Indicate, from a Durkheimian perspective, certain objects become laden with value placed on them by the group, whereas for those outside the circle of the community, they're not sacred at all. And the third definition that we drew on was William James' definition, and he kind of moves around with various definitions, but this one, he talked about the common nucleus of religion is the awareness that the higher part of the self is coterminous and continuous with a more of the same quality. Ralph Piedmont, another psychologist of religion, has a scale that defines religion and spirituality in terms of spiritual transcendence. And so his definition is in this kind of tradition. So what we did is we turned these 3 definitions into 3 competing hypotheses. The first was that across cultures, people would tend to appraise experiences in which non-empirical agents seem to be present as religious or spiritual. So that's at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, we have what we're calling the Durkheimian variation hypothesis, which that social mediation of human perceptions of sacrality would lead us to predict a great deal of cultural variation in what people appraise as religious or spiritual. And kind of in the middle would be what we call our Jamesian self-transcendence hypothesis, where the self-sense of connection to something more would lead us to predict that experiences of self-transcendence would be appraised as religious or spiritual. Okay, so here's the experience items that we use to investigate the hypotheses. And the colors here are actually important because I'm going to keep coding things in these colors. So for the Taylorian core hypothesis, we took the 5 presence items that are in bold and 4 or 5 whatever other items that we thought suggested a presence but didn't actually refer to presences in the item. For the Jamesian self-transcendence hypothesis, we took our diminished self item, which refers to feeling small in relation to something large and powerful, as our key self-transcendence item, but we have several that involve alterations of the self, such as out-of-body experience, past life, and automaticity. So those are there as a subset. And then basically, we didn't include all for the Durkheimian variation, but a large percentage of the rest are there, categorized in terms of emotion, emotion-related, meaning-related, and health-related. And pain is there because that eventually got modified to refer to physical pain only, not mental anguish. Okay, so in terms of participants, as you've already gathered, we translated the inventory into Hindi and validated it there. We did so, we started that process back in 2017, and we decided on the US and India for, because they're both highly religiously pluralistic countries, because both of them at the time were on an online platform, Amazon's Mechanical Turk, and as I indicated earlier, because we had experts on South Asian religions and Hinduism in my department. I would just add for you guys that Brazil has always been my ideal next place to compare because it's also highly religiously pluralistic, but in contrast to India, where Hinduism's the dominant tradition, and the US, where Protestant Christianity is the historically dominant tradition, here Catholicism is the dominant, or at least historically dominant tradition, and the influence of Afro-Brazilian religions is likely to give some really interesting additional results. So hopefully we'll hear more from the Brazilian team on this. Unfortunately, although our goal was to collect 1,000 responses in India and the US, we maxed out on the Hindi speakers on Mechanical Turk and weren't able to get anywhere near 1,000 responses. So that piece of information, there were more than 204 responses. But it turns out that the most interesting comparisons are when we break it down into our 4 largest groups. Because the people who are neither religious nor spiritual in the US, as you can see here, the nuns, we had 355 of them. They skew the overall US reports in a way that, for the sake of how little time I have left, I left out all that. So what you're going to see is the Christian group in the US, the spiritual but not religious group in the US, the nuns in the US, and the Hindus in India. Okay? So for the Taylorian core hypothesis, this table, and we've got 2 different ways of cutting our data. So I'm going to talk you through this first bit kind of carefully. This table gives the percentages in rank order of those who said they had a given experience and appraised it as religious or spiritual. It does not indicate how often people reported these experiences. It just tells you what percentage of those who did have the experience appraised it as religious or spiritual. So in support of the Taylorian core hypothesis, we found that the 5 experiences in the presence category, which are the dark purple, were the experiences most likely to be praised as religious or spiritual in the US and in India, with all 5 items appearing in the top 11 out of 38 or out of 40 in this actual one in both countries. But notice too that when comparing the 4 groups, the presence items in dark purple and the presence suggestive items in light purple were clustered together relatively tightly for the 3 US groups and are spaced apart more for the Hindu rankings, which suggests that in India, other items were just as likely to be appraised as religious or spiritual as the presence items. Okay, this kind of graph, and here let me just say, I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs that look like this. And the groups appear on the x-axis in the same order every time in these groups of 4. So it goes Christians, SBNRs, nuns, and Hindus on the x-axis for each cluster. And on the y-axis, which indicates the frequency of yes responses to an experience, whether or not they appraised it as religious or spiritual. I cut that off at the 75 mark on the top. So you have to imagine it going up higher to 100%. But this is just so that it's a little bit bigger on the screen. So in this graph, the solid and cross-hatched purple indicates the percent who appraised the experiences as religious or spiritual. And the gray indicates the percent who had the experience and did not consider it religious or spiritual. So each bar allows you to compare the size of these 2 groups. And relative to the Taylorian core hypothesis, the key finding is that even though the nuns, who would not consider themselves as religious or spiritual, the nuns were more likely to appraise the presence items as religious or spiritual than any of the other experiences they reported. But we can also use the bars to visualize the percent who appraised the experience as religious or spiritual out of the proportion of respondents who reported having had the experience. So this is RS out of purple and gray added together. And so this allows us to see that the 3 religious groups were not only more likely to appraise the presence items as religious or spiritual than the nuns, but the 3 religious or spiritual groups had more instances of religious or spiritually appraised experiences than did the nuns. So the purple bars for the religious groups are all higher than the purple bars for the nuns. And so before we move on to the self-transcendence hypothesis, I want to look more closely at differences between the 4 groups, focusing on the first 3 items to highlight some issues for further research. So notice here that the prevalence scores vary between groups. Presence dead is the least prevalent of the 3 experiences for the religious groups, and the one where the nuns' prevalence score is closest to the others. based on further work that we've done on presence experiences in the US that Elliott will talk about on Saturday, we know that the identity of spiritual presences tends to differ between our items. So the presences people experience as guiding them tend to be deities. The spirits of the dead on presences dead tend to be dead loved ones, and the non-ordinary presences tend to be a mix of deities, other sorts of spiritual beings, and spirits of the dead. Thus, in the US, differences in the prevalence between guidance and presences non-ordinary on the one hand, and presences of the dead on the other, are likely due to Christians and spiritual but not religious people cultivating the presence of God and other spiritual beings, while in the US, neither they nor the nuns engage, for the most part, in practices that are intended to make the dead present. So the variation in prevalence of RS experiences of presence suggests that social mediation, as stressed by Durkheim, has a role to play, along with a general tendency to appraise experiences of presence as religious or spiritual. But further work is needed to understand the differences between these items in India, and I would love to see the comparison extended to Brazil, where I expect we would see other patterns in RS prevalence. Okay, so now moving to the self-transcendence hypothesis. Okay, to the table we just had before, I've added diminished self to the graph. And we found that although the percent who appraised diminished self as religious or spiritual was less than for the presence items, the prevalence of religiously appraised experiences was greater than for the presence experience for each of the four groups. So the height of the yellow bars is higher than that of the purple bars. So that means basically religiously interpreted experiences of self-transcendence are numerically more common than these experiences, religious experiences of presences. And if we rank the items based on the prevalence of religiously appraised experiences, diminished self is ranked highly by all four groups. It's first for the US Christians, SBNRs, and none, and fourth for the Hindus, but it's following three emotion items and is still above all the presence items. So overall, the prevalence of RS appraised experiences was much lower for the nuns compared to around 30% for the three religious groups. Nevertheless, diminished self was the nuns' most common religious experience, along with presences of the dead. So these results also offer strong support for the self-transcendence hypothesis. But neither the Taylorian core hypothesis or the self-transcendence hypothesis accounts for the range of other experiences that the three groups appraised as religious or spiritual. So this shows the highest ranked experience based on religious prevalence, religious or spiritual prevalence, for the three RS groups, leaving out the nuns, since their RS prevalence scores were all 6% or less. And you notice here that emotion and meaning items in green and blue are in the top ranks, along with diminished self and some of the presence items. Turns out that these additional items can be divided into two types. Some of them, such as devotion to people and devotion to objects, are commonly considered as religious experiences by only one group, whereas other experiences such as peace and joy are commonly considered religious experiences by all three of the groups. So I want to discuss those two separately. So here you have experiences, the 5 experiences where the RS prevalence differed significantly for one group relative to one or two of the others. And the group that stands out is indicated by the stripe bar. So the most striking differences are on the left, in the differences between devotion to people, and the one next to that, devotion to objects. Those stand out in India compared to the 2 US religious groups. So we're talking about devotion. We know from our validation process, the Indians are talking about devotion to people such as gurus and devotion to objects such as murtis, which have the deity, in them. They're talking about that a lot, along with other sorts of experiences that are never talked about by people in the US, or very little. And special places, in terms of thinking of religious sites, is more common among Hindus than it is among US Christians. Again, a predominantly Protestant country and not in Europe where you have a lot of traditional pilgrimage sites. And because Protestant Christianity tends to discourage devotion to objects, such as the Blessed Sacrament, as well as holy people and places, it'll be really interesting to see how Brazilian Catholics score on these items. We also found that deep insight is more commonly viewed as a religious experience by the SBNRs than by the US Christians, and that finding meaning in coincidences is less common among Indian Hindus than either US Christians or US SBNRs. So the differences on this table or graph provide strong evidence for the Durkheimian variability hypothesis for certain experiences. So here's the prevalence of the 4 experiences that were similarly high among all 3 religious groups. So we've got peace, joy, awe, and meaning in life. And it is not clear whether this shared sense of what counts as religious or spiritual offers support for the Durkheimian variability hypothesis, since this pattern appears across all 3 religious groups. It could be that these types of religious experiences or experiences considered religious may be common for only some groups, which would support the variation hypothesis. Or they may be common across many cultures and traditions, in which case they would not support the variability hypothesis. So we'll need to do further research to find out if the tendency to sacralize these 4 experiences is culturally limited or widespread. Which brings me to conclusions. So we did find support for all 3 hypotheses. The Taylorian, we saw that experiences of non-empirical agents tend to be appraised as RS by all groups sampled, and experiences of self-transcendence as measured by our diminished self item are or were among the most prevalent for all 4 groups sampled. And we found some important variations that I mentioned. Hindus are more likely to sacralize people and objects than US Christians or SBNRs, and more likely to sacralize places than the US Christians. But no one definition of religious or spiritual captures all of what counts as religious or spiritual in these 2 cultural contexts. So that's really critical for people who are trying to stipulate a definition of religion. It's clear that the common definitions are not well designed, are not able to capture the range of things that people mean by that. And then we found other types of experiences that were among the most prevalent for all the groups sampled. And we don't know if the prevalence of these experiences is limited to certain groups or widespread across traditions. And It's possible that they indicate cultural variation, but it could be another understanding of what it means to be religious or spiritual